this video, we will be looking at two elements of fiction which have formed a very fundamental part of our lives, either as children or have influenced us as adults. These elements are the fable and the short story. So, what we are going to do is we're going to look at their features. And as far as I'm concerned, I have found the fable to be a very effective and interesting method of imparting some very valuable lessons in life, not just to young children, but also to adults. And the reason for this is because it is couched in the kind of narrative that appeals to people across ages and time. And in a previous video, I have talked about how relevant the short story is to the modern age on account of the way that it is structured, which makes for the perfect package as far as reading in these very busy and hectic times are concerned. So, the fable and the short story are two kinds of narratives that have a great deal of significance across humanity. The fable, the name is derived from the Latin word fabula, which means story. Now, as I have already mentioned, a fable is a narrative that has a moral. Only animals or birds are used as a central character in order to convey this moral. So we could say that the fables are anthropomorphic narratives because they attribute human characteristics to animals or birds, like the fox that looked at the grapes and wanted to eat the grapes, and they were too far, so he said the grapes are probably sour and walked away. So these are pretty human characteristics, being able to walk away, think in this fashion, have a conversation, so fables are anthropomorphic narratives, and of course the plot will have the animals or the birds having conversations which have a moral or philosophical message, like two goats that were coming from either side of a narrow bridge, and either of them refused to back off, so they fought and both of them fell into the river and they drowned. There is an alternate version of the story where the two goats come from either side of the bridge, and assessing the situation, what they do is that one goat willingly kneels down and the other walks over him and gets to the other side. So while the first fable was a lesson in how one should not allow one's ego to get ahead of oneself, the second fable, which had the same character, so to speak, asked us to forego our ego and cooperate for the greater good and safety. Now, fables are one of the most ancient form of narration known to human beings, because that's another reason why these animals or birds are introduced as central characters, because at that point of time there was only nature that man could draw from as examples. So his imagination kind of was restricted to these spheres. He could talk about nature, he could talk about God, and that was about it. So, and not only that, introducing animals or birds makes the fable rather universal and not culture specific. So when you do that, what happens is that it prevents people from feeling exceptionally hurt or thinking that, oh, this doesn't apply to me. This is about a man, I am a woman, or this is about a woman, and I am a man. So people might try to detach themselves from the central message of the fable, because all said and done, fables are, let's say, lessons in life that we are supposed to learn, but we don't like to practice, like cooperation, not showing excessive greed, not betraying your friends, see, all of these things. But people fall prey to temptation and they end up doing these things. So if you make the fable non-universal, if you make it very specific, what happens is that people try to detach themselves from these experiences and think that it doesn't apply to them. And fables are present in almost all cultures. Now, one of the most famous examples of fables are, of course, Aesop's fables that were written around 550 BC. And, those were the stories I told you about the fox and the grapes and the two goats and so on. But India, I hope you know, has a very rich tradition of fables. One example is the Jataka tales, which narrates the different births of the Buddha. See, it is not believed that it was just one Gautama Buddha who was born and then he passed away and that was it. No, it is believed that the Bodhisattva was born across times, across yugas, went through the entire cycle of life and birth across various time spans. So, in various Jataka tales, he could be featured as an elephant, he could be featured as a king or an outcast. But what he would essentially stand for was some very important values or virtues that he symbolized. So, through the figure of the Bodhisattva, what would happen is that, an important lesson would be given. Okay, for example, in the Jataka tales, there is a story which involves crows and an owl. So there is a king who is being told this story by the minister. Okay, because a king wants to attack a rival kingdom, and the minister tells him to have patience. And he gives him this example where an owl was being chased by some crows, and it flies into a bush, some bushes there. And what happens is that the crows are all waiting around, thinking that the owl is going to come out anytime. Now, as you know, when it is night, other birds cannot see, but the owl can see very well at night, which means that by just simply waiting for night, the owl could have assured himself of having survived this onslaught. But what the owl does is that he comes out before his time and is pecked to death by the crows. And the minister tells the king, see, this is what happens if perform an action before the right time. And then, the external narrator tells us, the readers, that I was the wise courtier. See, so their I is the Buddha, if you understand what I mean. So it is the Buddha or the Bodhisattva who talks to the king and gives him advice. So this wisdom, the relevance of patience, these were the lessons that were being passed on through the Jataka tales, through the figure of the Buddha. Now, Panchatantra, of course, Panchatantra that was compiled by Vishnu Sharma is again a very important part of the Indian cultural heritage. And again, it was written as a book, a guidebook, or an instruction manual for kings to help them rule in a just and fair manner. See, again, you see why it was, birds and animals that were the central character in the Panchatantra also, so that again, kings do not withdraw from their duties or think that this doesn't apply to me or feel offended, that there could be some derogatory references and so on. And again, in the Panchatantra, there is another very interesting story, which again involves the crows and the owls, where there are these owls who are very, very oppressive towards the crows. Okay, they have a huge tree where they have built their nest, and they ritually, regularly would go and attack these crows and drive them away. So finally, the crows decided to hatch a plan, and one of the intelligent crows said, I want all of you other crows to attack me, and I will fly to the king of the owls for refuge. So, this crow is brutally attacked, and he goes and falls in front of the king of the owls, who takes pity upon him and says, I will protect you from these other crows. Don't worry, come inside. And, this tree has a small hollow at the base of the tree. And the king of the owls tells him, you can, live with us in our palace. And the crow says, no, my lord, I don't want to do that because all the other owls might mind. So I'll just stay here at the foot of this tree and live quietly. Thank you for protecting me. And the crow is fed a lot of food and he grows strong and his feathers grow all lustrous and so on. And the crow starts to build a nest. Okay, so he brings in twigs from all parts of the forest and he's building this very cozy nest for himself. And once at night, sorry, during the daytime, the owls all have gone out to hunt, and then they return and they're sleeping. As you know, owls sleep during the daytime, and the crow tells his other crows to come bearing twigs that are burning. So they get these twigs and drop them at the base of the tree where the nest had been built, and the tree catches fire and the owls die, with the smoke and the flames and so on. So the moral of the story is, do not trust your enemy under any circumstance. Now, how far this is true or how far this is ideal, because we also have a great man telling us that we should forgive our enemies and we should be kind to them and do unto our enemies as we would have others do unto them. So, if you think this is conflicting advice, well, that was the Panchatantra after all. Another text from India is something called the Hitopadesha, which was again compiled by Narayan Pandit. And again, in the Hitopadesha, this is also a very interesting story. There was a blind vulture who was living atop a tree, and the other birds were feeding him. So, in a bout of kindness, he would look after the baby birds of these other birds. And a cat that was passing by saw this blind bird looking after these other birds. So he goes to the blind vulture and tells him, please accept me as your student. I have become completely vegetarian. I have changed my character. I am very good. And he gains the trust of the vulture as well as the baby birds. And one afternoon, while the vulture was sleeping, he eats all the baby birds. Okay, and without knowing any of these things, the vulture goes and is resting in another place where the bones of these baby birds were lying around. He didn't realize it. In the evening, the other birds returned and found their children had disappeared, and then they find this vulture sitting around amidst their bones. And without asking any clarification, without kind of seeking any explanation, the other birds peck the vulture to death and they kill him. Again, the moral of the story is, do not trust your enemies. So it's a very interesting conundrum, that the Hitopadesha also presents. But anyway, like I said, since this was an instruction manual, like the Panchatantra, on behavior, on caution, on how to conduct yourself in the company of others, all of these things, they were very, very valuable in that sense of the term. So I would say that a fable is a didactic narrative which helps to effectively convey a moral, and it is essential for teaching values. And the anthropomorphic element that is embedded in the fables makes them universally identifiable, as well as it helps get across cultural reach. So this is the advantage of the fable. On the other hand, could be anthropomorphic, or it could have actual human beings in it. It could be a story that involves machines. Now, in a previous video, I had talked about some of the essential features of the short story, particularly its length. A short story is shorter than a novella and definitely shorter than a novel. Okay, so the hierarchy of fiction, as far as length is concerned, it's the epic, okay, or the novel for that matter, then the novella, and then the short story. So, as is mentioned here in the definition, it's a short piece of fiction that deals with a limited set of characters and a very specific time period. Now, as you all understand, literature is not something that will obey watertight compartments. So, when I say it has a very specific time period, it could be one day, it could be 1 month, but short stories don't really obey these ideal parameters of time. It could have spread out over a period of years, actually. A short story can compress within it a number of years. So, but certain characteristics remain the same. That is, a short story will not have an expansive setting like how a novel has, or an epic has for that matter. See, the kind of setting that went into the Ramayana or the Mahabharata cannot be seen in a short story. Okay, because it just doesn't have the time to do that. And the narration is very brisk, and not a lot of background details are given, a lot of descriptions are given. See, because the length of the short story demands that, the narration be very fast, and you don't waste a lot of time on background details unless the story is about the background. See, for example, if the story is about the woods, okay, the forest, a forest somewhere, then there's no point talking about the characters because the story is about the forest, right? So yeah, and the plot of a short story cannot be very complicated, and you can't have 10, 15 characters stuffed into a short story, because first of all there is no time, and the next thing is that you can't be giving background details of all of these people, so the story becomes very, very difficult to handle. So therefore, short stories generally have very limited number of characters, and these characters won't be given elaborate backstories or lengthy introductions, and much of the story is told to us as the narrative itself progresses. Most of the background will come to us as the story progresses. For example, there could be two people, James and Jeremy, and they're walking along the street, and at one point something happens, and then the narrator might say, Jeremy, who was James's brother-in-law, slipped and fell on the ice. See, that's when you understand that they were related in this fashion. Otherwise, the narrator will not, or the author will not want to waste so much of time talking about practically nothing. So, in a way, we could say that the short story has been around for a very, very long time. Because if you look at it objectively, a fable is a short story. The parables, are also short stories. Parables are those, examples that Jesus gives in the Bible, of the Pharisee and so on. So those tales that are said, in a way, they are also short stories. Okay. Then, of course, you have tales of battles and wars and love and romance. You have another, form where it's a continuation of stories, like the Panchatantra for that matter, or like the Hitopadesha, which are linked to each other, and they just keep going on and on and on like that. So 1001 Arabian Nights is an example like that, where a story is told, and then there is a story within that story, then there is another story within that story. So these innovations are also there. Now, with the passage of time, the nature of the short stories have also changed. So, some of the earliest examples in English include Canterbury Tales. Okay, then of course, this is not English, but Boccaccio's Decameron is also a fine example of short story. Okay, short fiction in the Middle Ages. So you see that any narration that has a shorter length can be considered to be a short story, provided it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But in the modern times, again, short stories can be open ended. They can be about nothing, or they could be about one very specific incident. They could just describe the incident and be done with that. Like I was reading a short story, about a woman who is attacked by a strange man in her own house. Okay. And the entire story talks about the brutality of that attack. And in the end, her dogs come to save her. That is it. The story ends there. That's a very interesting kind of a story, but yeah. Okay, so you might be familiar with some of these names that I'm giving here. They are some of the greatest short story writers in the world. Edgar Allan Poe, okay, he has written these gothic stories, full of horror and haunted places and spirits that seem to look for salvation and so on. Then another person who was very sensitive in the way he wrote was somebody called Nikolai Gogol. Okay, you have Anton Chekhov, the Russian master. Gogol was also Russian. Then you have Saki, or H.H. Munro, as his name is. Saki was this humorous, witty kind of a writer who relied a lot on the beauty of words in order to, make his stories very, very interesting. You have O. Henry, who is considered to be the master of the short stories that have that essential twist at the end. Mentioned before, a short story definitively has to have character, setting, a conflict. It has to be about something. A conflict doesn't necessarily mean a fight or a kind of physical violence or anything. It just means that what exactly is the story about, the theme, and the plot. All of these things are very, very important in a short story. And this is what makes a short story more challenging than a novel, on account of the fact that, while novel gives you a great deal of space and, length, etc., a short story is something into which, a lot of technical mastery has to go into in order to make the short story appealing, in order to prevent it from bloating up or from being, very, very sparse and not revealing anything. So the balance of the short story has to be just right. And it must be short enough to satisfy the curiosity of the reader. At the same time, it should be interesting without being too vague or lacking details. See, this is the conundrum that the short story presents. All right. Now, there are three kinds of short stories. One is the epical story. Now, the epical story always has a very clear narrative, and there's a surprise ending. The twist, like the O. Henry twist. One example is The Gift of the Magi by him himself, by O. Henry himself, where there's this young couple, and they have got gifts for each other. But the man gets the woman a set of combs, which are very expensive, and the woman, gets the man a watch chain, a chain for his watch. And the thing is that he sold his watch to buy the comb, and she cut her hair and sold it to buy the chain. So it's that, at the end, when these gifts are opened and given to each other, the surprise and the shock that they have, that is what forms the twist. So such stories are called epical stories. Okay. Now, another type is the lyrical story, which focuses on a recurring image. One classic example is that of the story called The Fly by Catherine Mansfield. And in this story, what happens is that there is a man who is grieving the death of his son, and he's sitting in front of his employee, a man who seems to have problems with his memory. He's an old man, and after the man leaves, this boss sees a fly that has fallen into his ink pot. Okay. And he tries to, he encourages the fly to rescue itself, and the fly, flies out of that inkwell. And then, what he does is he drops a drop of ink on the fly, and again, it shakes itself off and tries to survive, and again he drops, a drop of ink on it. And this happens one more time. And then he says, "This is absolutely the last time, and I want you to survive." But the fly doesn't survive. And in the image of the fly, what we see is we see the grief that he has for his son. Okay, we see that this fly could actually mean his son for him, where he is actually telling his son to survive the war and come home, knowing fully well that he is dead. He wishes that his son had struggled to live the way that the fly had lived. Okay, and also on another level, you can see that maybe the boss is actually being God. Mm? He's being God in the sense that when he's, dropping this ink on the fly, it's a game to him. So probably human beings are like flies to the gods, as is said in a play by Shakespeare. They kill us for their sport. Okay, so that is the lyrical story. Okay, a story that focuses on a recurring image, and this image forms the central concern of the story. It is on this image that the entire story rests. Okay, then the next is the artifice story, which kind of brings together two unrelated elements to make a story. It could have a very surreal kind of a beginning, and then narrates the entire story based on that surreal image. Now, one example is, Kafka's Metamorphosis. It's kind of a novella, actually, not exactly a short story, where, the opening lines are: "One morning, Gregor Samsa woke up to find himself, changed into a giant cockroach." And then the entire story revolves around how this man, negotiates this whole metamorphosis that has come over him. Okay, so that's sort of a bizarre thing which we obviously know is false, but for the sake of the story, we continue to chase it. That is what is called the artifice story. Okay, so if we were to do a quick recap of the short story, we understand that a short story is a genre of fiction that requires a great deal of technical mastery and understanding of the craft, because not only does it have to obey the conventions of requiring characters and settings and having a central conflict, a theme and a plot, but it also has to hold the reader's interest by giving him just the sufficient amount of details that he can use to read the entire story. Okay, so and whether they be fables or parables, any narrative that is significantly short in length can be considered to be a short story if it tells you a story, and if it is short, it is a short story. Okay, and then of course we have looked into the three kinds of short stories: the epical story, lyrical, and the artifice. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you very much.